I'm delighted to introduce Professor Matthew Ratcliffe. Matthew is Professor for Theoretical Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna, and he will be joining the University of York in September 2018. His research spans the field of phenomenology, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of psychiatry, emotional research, and philosophy of mind. Among his very numerous publications are the recently published monograph Real Hallucinations, Psychiatric Illness, Intentionality, and the Interpersonal World, and Experiences of Depression, a study in phenomenology, as well as the previously published Feelings of Being, Phenomenology, Psychiatry, and the Sense of Reality. Today, the topic of Matthew's presentation is social estrangement and the sense of reality.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Thanks to the organisers as well for putting together this event and for inviting me. So, okay, what I want to do in this talk is explore the relationship between pervasive forms of social estrangement and changes in what I call our sense of reality. And by our sense of reality, I mean our grasp of the distinction between something as present or not present, perceptually present or not present, and a wider grasp of what it is to be the case or not the case. This isn't an epistemological thing. It's not about being able to distinguish what's present from what isn't, or what's the case from what's not. It's our more basic sense that there is a difference. Our grasp of what it is for something to be present or otherwise, what it is to be the case or otherwise. And ordinarily this is pre-reflective, unproblematic, and integral to our experience. And I'm going to try and do two things. First of all, I'm going to suggest that in order to understand, in fact, a wide range of anomalous kinds of experience, we have to make a distinction that often eludes people and causes lots of confusions. And that is a distinction between the level of confidence in which something is taken to be the case, the level of conviction of a belief, you might say. Or one might similarly say the degree to which something appears present, and the kind of presence that it has, or the kind of confidence, the kind of conviction that's involved. What we have in many cases is, if you like, a heightened degree of presence or a heightened degree of confidence, but there's a change in the whole structure of the sense of reality, in the sense of what it is to be present, what it is to be the case. So it looks as if someone's holding a really confident belief, but this is occurring against the backdrop of a diminished sense of reality. So you can have changes in the form of experience, in the form of belief, that are easily confused with degrees of confidence. And I'm going to try and tease that apart. For example, it's commonplace to think of a hallucination as something appearing present when it's not, in just the same way as it would appear present if that thing was really there. And most hallucinations are absolutely nothing like that. Well, a delusion is often said to consist in a false belief, which is really weird, because how could someone believe something like that? It's just taken for granted that it's the same kind of conviction, the same kind of perceptual experience, and the puzzle is why somebody would hold that belief or have that kind of experience. But one thing I want to do is make clear that this just isn't the case at all. Something can appear absolutely certain, in the case of a belief, in scare quotes. I don't like the term belief. Philosophers tend to tout this univocal notion of belief. I think it conflates all sorts of different things that are subtly different and allows them to get away with all sorts of dodgy philosophical manoeuvres. So something can appear sort of absolutely certain or fully present, but in a very different way to something else. Effectively, phenomenologically construed, what we have are different kinds of intentional attitudes, where the differences are seldom made clear. So that's the first thing I want to do. And the second task is to show how the relevant alterations in the sense of presence and reality are inextricable from alterations in how we experience other people in general, more specifically what we anticipate from other people in general, and how one relates to the wider social world. Now, I think it's worth noting that a pervasive sense of alienation from other people is absolutely central to most, if not all, of those experiences associated with diagnoses of severe psychiatric illness. And I think even though this is just from an autobiography of someone with no clinical qualifications, this gets it about right. You know, get me when I'm doing philosophical stuff and I'll make it all complicated and talk about Husserl and Heidegger and things, but get me in a pub after about 6 pints of beer and I'll say, yeah, this is pretty much how it goes. So this is Tracy Thompson in an autobiographical account of depression, saying, I wanted a connection I couldn't have. It's what you find a lot of people saying, it's impossible to connect with other people, to experience a sense of interpersonal connection that we more usually anticipate and take for granted. Didn't understand or appreciate the ones I did have. It was the story I saw time and time again on the ward. Only connect, E.M. Forster had written. That's a reference to the novel Howard's End. But we hadn't, or couldn't, or never had. And she goes on. The blackness might not even be obvious to others, but on our side of that severed connection, it was hell, a life lived behind glass. The only difference between mild depression and severe schizophrenia was the amount of sound and air that seeped in. That little bit of it, that last bit's a bit too quick, it's slightly more complicated than that, but never mind. So sometimes other people are distant, unreachable, as if one's stranded on another planet, on an island, away from everyone else, behind impenetrable glass. There are all sorts of metaphors and analogies that are used. On other occasions, others appear hostile and threatening, perhaps as generic, indistinguishable judges of one's guilt and wretchedness, primed to punish one at any instant. And so what we have in these cases is that instead of anticipating the possibility of interpersonal connection, the prospect of encountering others, a kind of anticipation that pervades the social world, might consist only of the potential to fall before a hostile gaze, or something even worse. That's all that the interpersonal world offers. And the kinds of predicaments I'm going to explore are all compatible with something like this. Now, our sense of presence and a more encompassing sense of reality are actually seldom explicitly addressed by philosophers in the context of psychiatry or more widely. So when philosophers are talking about perceptual content, they might say, oh, you know, do we perceive this, or is this non-perceptual cognitive stuff, and how rich is perceptual content, and so on. But the question, what is it to experience something as there at all, as present? What does this actually involve? People seldom ask that. One exception is Alba Noe, so don't worry, I'm not putting you alongside the guilty, you have done this. But lots of people don't. And in psychiatry, when it comes to hallucinations and delusions, people don't do this either, at least a lot of the time. Rather, the question is, well, do they really believe this? Are they really perceiving that? And if so, why? And what's not asked is, well, what does the relevant sense of presence or sense of conviction consist of? Is it the same as that associated with mundane forms of belief and mundane perceptual experiences? Now, an interesting exception I want to look at briefly is Agonias, in a paper from 1972, which I think went largely unnoticed, though it seems to be increasingly quoted recently. And Agonias is interesting on two counts. First of all, he suggests that the sense of presence isn't a singular, unitary achievement. He's focusing specifically on perceptual presence. Rather, it consists of a range of factors, and he offers this analysis here. He says, there are qualities of sensation versus ideation, behavioural relevance or irrelevance, publicness, privateness, objectivity, subjectivity, existence, non-existence, involuntariness, involuntariness, and then a real low point in his analysis, independence or dependence from a quite unusual mental state in oneself, which just restates one's explanandum in different words. There are all sorts of criticisms one could raise about this. One could say, well, what does this criterion actually mean? What are you saying? How does one criterion relate to others? Are some of these reducible to others? And I won't go into that now. But I think more interesting is the question, which again he doesn't address, of which combination of qualities is necessary or sufficient for presence. To complicate things, and this is the route I would take, it could be that different combinations of qualities are sufficient for presence, thus implying that there are qualitatively different forms of presence that need to be distinguished if we want to understand various forms of anomalous experience, and indeed human experience more generally. Indeed, perhaps some factors are important when we're experiencing certain entities and not others. Despite the various lacunas and objections, I think this account remains very, very informative for current purposes. And that's because it explicitly acknowledges that the sense of presence is non-unitary and multifaceted. Furthermore, it implies that factors can come apart from each other and even come into conflict, leading to experiences that are imbued with ambiguity and tension. More importantly, exactly this same form of questioning can be generalised from perceptual presence to the sense of reality as a whole, if you like, to the structure of intentionality. So you can say, well, what gives you the sense of this is here, now, which is so central to the experience of it as perceived. But you can equally say, well, in virtue of what is this experience as imagined, or as remembered, or as believed rather than merely entertained, or as anticipated? So you can ask these kinds of questions about the structure of intentionality as a whole, about our fully nuanced grasp of the distinctions between is and is not, and all the variants, was not, might be, might not be, is anticipated, is, one can go on and it's not entirely clear what the structure as a whole consists of. But focusing in a bit more, something that is quite interesting is that Agonius turns more specifically to auditory verbal hallucinations in a population of patients he identifies as schizophrenic. And he's keen to look at this concrete case and investigate whether and how the sense of these phenomena, these voices as present, lacks any of these features. And you might say, well, there's going to be a lot of variety in the responses because this stuff is pretty difficult to interpret. As a philosopher, I find it hard. So, are they public or private? Well, that may be okay. Do they exist or don't they exist? I don't know about that. But in fact, the responses were remarkably consistent. His subjects said yes to all but one of these qualities. The peculiar one is publicness and privateness. In this case, 13 responses were positive. Yes, these voices that I heard appeared public. But 2 were doubtful and 30 of them were negative. And this sounds peculiar. He doesn't really elaborate on this. But we might wonder how to interpret responses to the other criteria. How can something be experienced as existent, objective, behaviourally relevant, independent of one's own mental state, but not public? I'm not going to attempt a full answer to that question here because you'd be waiting a very long time and Anna would be just anxiously waving cards around at me for about 2 hours. But I'm going to try something more modest. I'm going to at least suggest the following: that a pervasive experience of estrangement from the public world, and an associated sense of one's experiential content as not fully lodged in the public world, can, in fact, seemingly paradoxically, but not in fact paradoxically at all, contribute to a heightened sense of their vividness in the case of a perception-like experience, or their certainty, irresistibility and immunity to challenge. And because of this tension between, if you like, an impoverished sense of reality, or a change in the sense of reality and presence, and the heightened confidence, or the heightened vividness, these experiences are often described in ways that are equivocal and ambiguous. I've only been going on for about 10 minutes, haven't I? Okay, that means I can inflict depression on you all as well as the other 2 examples. So I've been working on depression for years. I'm sick of it now, but I can't quite stop mentioning it. I'm really working on it. But I'm going to start with something that isn't classified usually as a delusion or as a hallucination. But it is a prevalent feature of very severe depression. The unwavering conviction that one will not recover, that one cannot recover, that recovery is impossible, that one is in this state forever, that one is damned. There is no way out. And it's not simply that it is highly unlikely that P, where P is the proposition I will recover. People say they can't contemplate the possibility of recovery. So there is an overwhelming sense of certainty associated with the inescapability of that predicament. Now, even the more specific diagnostic category, major depression, encompasses a heterogeneous range of experiences, and there are all sorts of nuanced distinctions to draw. So what I'm going to give you now is abstract and simplistic, but I think still serves to make the point I want to make. This isn't, in fact, a circumscribed belief at all. It's actually symptomatic of a much more pervasive change in the structure of experience, where the world as a whole seems to lack certain kinds of significant possibility. So take the very general possibility that things could change for the better, that things appear significant now as things having changed for the better, that things point to the possibility of things changing for the better. That is altogether gone from experience, sometimes from imagination, sometimes even from memory. I remember propositionally that it wasn't always like this, but I can't feel that. It feels like I've been depressed forever. So even when a particular situation seems hopeless, the possibility of hope in our lives, however inchoate, in some as yet undetermined way, things could get better. But imagine a world from which this has gone altogether. This implies the more specific conviction that one will not recover. Essentially what you have is the following. So the sense that things could change for the better is more usually integral to a sense of one's situation as contingent, as open, as dynamic, to an appreciation that it could change in ways that matter. So drained of the prospect of positive change, the world can only offer up more of the same, or something even worse. So your whole situation's experience is inescapable, something that's often conveyed in terms of being imprisoned, entombed, trapped, encased in carbonite, or stuck behind a sheet of impenetrable glass. And we find something, we don't have to struggle hard to interpret first-person accounts in order to see this. I'll just give you a few. So just to read out the first one here, you can't see into the future, so you can't see aspirations or dreams. Everything I ever wanted to do with my life seems impossible now. I also would think that I'd never get out. I'd be depressed forever. Here's some more. When depressed, I see life as pointless and sometimes cruel. I can't see any possibilities for change or improvement. That kind of possibility has gone from the world. The world holds no possibilities for me when I'm depressed. Every avenue I consider exploring seems shut off. And those are testimonies I collected myself via a questionnaire study. Now, importantly, this loss of possibility that gives rise to the sense of certainty, this impoverishment of one's world, this loss of contingency from it, this change in the sense of reality, is inextricable from how one experiences and relates to other people, and more specifically what one anticipates from interpersonal relations. Indeed, I'm increasingly inclined to suggest that in many cases, the loss of contingency from the world is identical to a certain pervasive sense of estrangement from other people. You can't have one without the other. So in brief, here's how it goes. Ordinarily, the anticipation of certain self-transformative forms of interpersonal connection imbues the world with a distinctive degree and kind of openness and spontaneity, a sense that this isn't all there is. The concrete possibilities I can currently entertain are not the only possibilities they are, because the possibility of interaction with others points to things that I can't anticipate in a concrete way. So where such possibilities remain for a kind of transformative interpersonal connection, one cannot experience one's current predicament as inescapable, or one's current perspective as exhaustive. But where they're lost, a draining of significance, of contingency from the world is implied. And in fact, I think this relates very nicely to what Sean was saying yesterday, where there are all these subtle ways in which we affect each other that are quite distinctive of the interpersonal. This bottle doesn't affect me the way Sean can if he growls at me now, which he didn't, But there's a range of empirical evidence looking at the subtle ways in which we regulate what appears salient, what appears significant. And we can offer different accounts of how this happens in the context of a close marriage, with friends, with people as a whole. But ordinarily, interpersonal experience is not exhausted by, but it includes the anticipation of a certain kind of interpersonal connection that can transform or enrich one's world. And while other kinds of interpersonal connection endure in depression, a lot of the time it's this positive connection that is lacking. I mean, an analogy I often use is that of taking a visiting speaker out for dinner. And I've decided to use it for the last time today because I keep doing it. And it's getting like one of those tired aging rock bands where they bang out the same song all the time. The only difference being that they have fans and I don't. But many of us have had an experience like this where we're asked to take the visiting speaker out. For some reason, no one else is available. You've never met this person and you have to take them out. So you book the restaurant and after the talk you say, okay, let's go then, I'm taking you for dinner. And in one scenario, you've really hit it off with this person. You find a subject of mutual interest that you forgot you had or awoken. The conversation darts spontaneously from A to B and back again. Gesture, expression, flow effortlessly. And as you're walking home, after a little bit of wine as well, everything seems enriched, new possibilities are opened up, a new significance is given to the world. Then imagine an alternative scenario where you and the speaker don't hit it off. It's so, you're from there. Yeah, that's right. So I hear you're working about this on this at the moment. Yeah, I am. What do you make of this? Don't know really. So what sort of interests you? Help. And what happens after a while, during the exchange and afterwards, is this peculiar draining of significance from one's surroundings. A homely restaurant can appear somehow unpleasant. One's own activities and thoughts and experiences slow down. One isn't solicited to respond to the situation anymore. It's as if the life is being sucked out of you. And as you go home on that dark, raining night, you feel somehow all over diminished. A sense of your future as a dimension of hope. Now it's one short step. Imagine the only thing you anticipate from other people is scenario B. That's all they offer. That, I'm suggesting, is a profound transformation of the world, which diminishes one's sense of reality. One isn't fully immersed in the public world in a way that is taken for granted, but at the same time gives rise to these certainties that are mistakenly understood in terms of mundane propositional belief of the kind that philosophers get too excited about. And again, I can give you lots of quotations that illustrate this. So people will say things like this: I feel less connected to people around me. They seem more distant and collectively living their lives around me, as if I'm not an active participant in my life. I assume that family dislike me and everyone's looking at me and thinking what a terrible person I am. And so on. So this sense of isolation from others, which is bound up, despite the diversity of depression, bound up with this wider transformation of the sense of being there and other things being there, the sense of what it is to be the case, not the case, present or otherwise. Let me give you two more examples, briefer, and these are very cursory. Sorry about that, but I can go into more detail in conversation if you'd like. So let's turn to delusion. The term delusion encompasses a huge range of things, so I'm not talking about all of them. I'm talking about what Carl Jaspers calls primary delusions in general psychopathology. And all I want to do is draw attention to a quotation from Jaspers that I think is under-remarked upon and very revealing. So just to recap briefly, he's got this famous account of how delusions crystallise from delusional atmosphere. Everything seems strange and unreal, and you've got rampant salience, dysregulation, and then he says that the delusional belief arises out of a kind of tension. There's a desperate need to make this more determinate, to resolve the ambiguity. So delusional interpretation crystallises to bring sense to this peculiar experience. And this is something he says that's akin to what we all do on occasion. So, if you wake up in a really foul mood, you'll find someone to get angry with eventually. it becomes more determinate, it coagulates. And this, he says, has a soothing effect. So this might seem like an endogenous process where an indeterminate experience gives rise to a determinate propositional attitude. And indeed, many people see it that way. But in fact, turn to this passage, which he inserted in 1946 into the German 4th edition. And I think perhaps the year 1946 has significance here. Maybe the events of the preceding years changed his view of things. But here, it becomes delusion is very much an interpersonal, social, public phenomenon. So he says normal convictions are formed in a context of social living and common knowledge. Immediate experience of reality survives only if it can fit into the frame of what is socially valid or can be critically tested. Experience of reality leads us to judgments of reality. Individual experience can always be corrected, but the total context of experience is something stable, can hardly be corrected at all. The source for incorrigibility, source of certainty, is not to be found in any single phenomenon, but the human situation as a whole, which no one would surrender lightly. And interestingly, if socially accepted reality totters, people become adrift, reality becomes reduced to an immediate and shifting present. And he goes on to remark that reality for the patient doesn't always carry the same meaning as that of normal reality. Now, he's saying a lot here, and there are several points that I've tried to distinguish in various places. But amongst other things, he's saying that taking something to be the case usually involves taking it to be part of a publicly accessible consensus world. Indeed, our distinction between is and is not hangs to a considerable degree on our grasp of what it is to be rooted in a public world or otherwise. That's why he says that estranged from the public world, reality doesn't carry the same meaning. The sense of reality is transformed. The sense of conviction is different. So again, sorry to be very cursory with this. Happy to discuss it at length later. But the point is that delusions on this scenario are absolutely not anomalous beliefs. They involve a different kind of conviction, a way of believing that's dislodged from a world that many of us take as given. But why certainty? It's a completely different kind of certainty. In the more usual case, a belief is firmly held because it's integrated into a shared public world to such an extent that it's taken for granted, not up for debate in most usual contexts, outside philosophical circles. At the very least, it's shared by a group of people with whom you identify in some way. But delusional beliefs on this account, at least as I interpret it, are inflexible precisely to the extent that they're not anchored in a shared world, the extent to which they're impervious to the influence of social regulatory practices. So this could involve, for instance, an absence of more usually taken for granted background trust, a just general assumption of others as credible and dependable in various ways. That's a prerequisite for the social regulation of belief formation, belief sustenance, belief revision. Without that, one is immune to the possibility of conflicting evidence. One is immune to processes of negotiation and renegotiation. That kind of evidential effect on belief isn't a possibility if one is estranged from others in a certain kind of way. So in the everyday case, certainty is usually symptomatic of being comfortably immersed in the shared world, while in the delusional case it's symptomatic of precisely the opposite, implicated through and through. Now, exactly this point can be applied as well to certain kinds of so-called hallucination. So let's take auditory verbal hallucinations, or voices again. You might think that the extent to which a voice seems present is a matter of its approximating a mundane auditory verbal experience. In other words, it seems present to the extent it's like hearing someone speak. But, surprise, surprise, that's not the case at all. I'm going to focus on a certain kind of experience that is often categorised as a verbal hallucination. There are loads of others. It captures all sorts of different phenomena that are usually mushed together, and then people wonder why the neurobiological data is not consistent. And that's because they're not dealing with a unitary phenomenon at all. But the kind of experience I have in mind is thought-like in certain respects, and it's certainly not unambiguously auditory. Indeed, some people say it's not auditory at all. Rather, I've suggested elsewhere that this kind of experience is plausibly construed as a linguistic crystallization of negative, self-directed emotion, where the negative reflects one's relationship with the social world as a whole, which usually takes the form of estrangement, dread, and rejection, and a sense of others as hostile. Here are a couple of examples that I've collected with former colleagues. I heard the voices of demons screaming at me, telling me that I was damned, that God hated me, that I was going to hell. It's hard to describe how I could hear. And note the scare quotes. People often put words like hear and voice in scare quotes, which are then ignored by interpreters who think, oh yeah, that means that they really are hearing voices. But people are often saying, look, this is how I'm describing it, but it's not really a voice. I don't really hear it. It's not really present in the way that you think it's present. But the words used and the emotions they contained, hatred and disgust, were completely clear, distinct, unmistakable, maybe even more so than if I heard them, clearer than if I'd heard them. One might say more present than if I'd heard them. They reflected all the judgmental attitudes of my community. Another case, I hate everything about myself. I hear a voice that confirms everything I think about myself. Sometimes feels as if I'm the only one, that it's the only one that will tell me the real truth about myself. I can't concentrate on anything but how I'm feeling and the voice I hear. So much of the time, experiences like this don't appear to emanate from out there at all. They're not even experienced as embedded in the public, socially acceptable world. People will say that, yeah, I know that this is occurring in me. I know that only I can experience this. At the same time, these experiences are sometimes described not only as unlike hearing, but as clearer than hearing, involving a kind of presence, a kind of presentation that is of a content that is more certain, more vivid, less deniable than mundane perception. Voices can seem, as one author writes, more real than reality, overwhelming, even when their experience is emanating from within. So why would that be? How could it be experienced as more real, and yet at the same time not anchored in a public world? A kind of phenomenon that is stripped of the usual sense of publicness that perception is imbued with. Why more real? Well, here's why I think. The content is experienced in a way that is very different to that of a mundane auditory experience. So Sean, could you insult me a minute? Say something really nasty to me.
I really hate your power.
Yeah. So Sean says that unsolicited. I didn't prompt him. Sean just blurts out, I really hate your PowerPoint. So what happens? If I hear Sean saying this, is that the worst you could come up with? I'm going to have to teach you to be more nasty. So when I hear this from Sean, I'm surprised. But hang on, there's the possibility of error. Maybe I misheard him. Maybe he just said, got something wrong with his throat. Or maybe he was talking to somebody else and I just overheard him. Or, even if he is directing this at me, maybe I've misunderstood the comment. Maybe there's something on my PowerPoint I didn't realise. Or maybe he's having a joke. And even if I acknowledge that this is a straightforward, malicious criticism of my PowerPoint, I can still say, Sean, I reject that criticism. I believe that you're wrong. I push myself away from this. So there are all these possibilities involved in interpreting and reinterpreting and negotiating, perhaps. I can try reasoning with him about my PowerPoint. It is a bit crap, actually. I should have more gimmicks on it. Really? Yours are much flashier. Yeah. You meant it, didn't you? But the point is that in the case of a concrete perceptual experience, there are these possibilities of pushing the content away in various ways, reinterpreting it or repudiating it. But when you're faced with a linguistic coagulation of your own self-directed emotional appraisal, these possibilities don't apply. If you're into Husserl, you could say a certain horizontal structure, a structure of possibility isn't there, one that might involve a sense of ambiguity or possibilities for reinterpretation and so on. Its content can't be reinterpreted or rejected, at least not in the same way. What you have is a peculiar kind of intentionality, a different kind of presence. So, in one sense, its experience is less real. It's removed from the public world, but it's also more real. The content appears more present in a certain way, just because you can't distance yourself from it. It definitely is this. This is something I can't repudiate, something I can't push away. The content has a certain power to it, which is why these voices are often perceived as being extremely powerful. As some authors have noticed, you can't get the same distance. And it's interesting, again, to look at some first-person remarks. So the judgment of the voice often comes with a heightened sense of authority. It knows you to an extent and in a way that makes its content irresistible. So just a few accounts here. It's not just like hearing a person's voice who's in the room with you. In a way, it's much more intimate, but it can also be much more remote. Again, because of these tensions, you see the ambiguities here. It's P, but not P. It's this, but not in the way you think it is. I didn't hear the voices orally. They were much more intimate than that, and therefore inescapable. It's more ghostly than a real voice. It knows everything about you because it's a part of you. They know me more intimately than others usually do, and so on. Now, of course, to complete the story, what's also required is an account of why something that's not experienced as part of the public world is still experienced as alien at all, in any way. And I'm not going to give you that now, but it's something I try to do in the book I published last year called Real Hallucinations, which I'm not plugging, honestly. I'm just mentioning it because I try and do it elsewhere in this way. But for current purposes, the point I want to make again is that a certain kind of certainty or vividness or presence, a distinctive kind of intentionality, is symptomatic of something's not being rooted in the public world in a way that is associated with a kind of estrangement, often a sense of others as threatening, a world that no longer invites interpersonal connection of a kind that is pleasant or reassuring. So these phenomena don't simply involve a heightened or diminished sense of presence relative to mundane perceptual experience in one or another modality. They also arise in the context of an estrangement from the social world, and sometimes, more specifically, in the context of a world where others appear only in the guise of hostility. And although I've only given you 3 cursory examples, I think the general point applies time and time again, and what's needed are all sorts of subtly different analyses of how various hard-to-understand experiences involve changes in the sense of presence, or a wider sense of reality, if you like, in a sense of the kind of intentional state one is in, the kind of intentional attitude one has. What's needed is an analysis of that, and an analysis not just of the degrees of confidence, or the degrees of presence, or the degrees of conviction, but also the kind of confidence or conviction involved. And I'll stop there.
We now have about 13 minutes for questions. Yes, please, at the back.
Thanks a lot. It was very interesting. I wanted, at the beginning you said that there might be different kind of presence depending on the kind of entities that you could be asking.
Yeah.
And then the rest of your talk, you gave this very nice and interesting description of the presence that you might have and all the social alienation. But it was kind of not making specific case for different kind of person that would be more present. So I wanted to know whether you had a specific prediction or whether it was a broad increase of this?
I think the pathological cases show you that there are different kinds of presence, and then the interesting thing would be to turn that back to supposedly more mundane forms of experience and kind of re-enchant the perceptual world a bit and flesh out various qualitative differences. But let me just give you one mundane example that may or may not work. Suppose it's a sunny day and you look up at the sky and you see a small cloud. It's not going to go in front of the sun, nothing's going to drop out of it, it's not a particularly attractive cloud. You experience it as there, albeit not close to you, but it's of no behavioural relevance. So you could say perhaps the behavioural relevance criterion doesn't apply there. But suppose you're standing on a tram track in Vienna, and then about where that door is, there's a tram approaching at high speed, ringing the bell, and you feel no urge to run, no sense of alarm, no motor solicitation whatsoever. That's quite old time. Yeah. That could contribute to a sense of the tram as not really there. This isn't really happening. How can there be a tram there if this doesn't appear behaviourally relevant? So I'm not sure how far one could pursue this, but I don't think, even in the course of everyday life, there is a singular mundane sense of presence. And I think the everyday term belief and the philosophical term mask a huge range of subtly different kinds of conviction. I don't believe that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris in the same way that I believe I'm going to die when I really grasp it. And when somebody loses a person they love, they don't believe that person is dead in exactly the same way at different stages of the grieving process. So I think what we can do is look at extreme cases to realise just how philosophical study of everyday experience and everyday belief has been oversimplified by many philosophers.
I had exactly the same question, but this variation gave me the response that you gave. So you mentioned other forms of loss of orientation, like, for instance, that of loving or boosting a loved one in grief. So are we dealing with a continuum? And I'm only asking because of the risk debate a few years ago whether or not we should classify this as something to be given into the DSM. What would you say about that?
I don't think that you're going to be able to make neat diagnostic distinctions. As I've indicated, I think these diagnoses are so embedded in relational structures that it's going to be inevitably messy, and I think diagnostic categories, when you pursue this kind of thinking, look increasingly inadequate for many purposes, although I'm not disputing their pragmatic value for certain purposes. When it comes specifically to something like grief versus depression, but it's something I'm working on at the moment. I have a few things to say, but I reckon it's going to take...
very easy parallels, because part of the, I guess, overcoming it or relating it is what's the matter of relating to loss.
Yeah, so grief is something I'm looking at in depth at the moment with a view to studying changes in the structure of perceptual experience, teasing out different forms of belief, and also looking at the topic that both Sean and I address, Sean in much more detail, these subtle ways in which people regulate the way that things appear salient to each other. One of the most sort of poignant examples of that, I think, is bereavement. So in the example of somebody loses not just their salience regulator, but they do lose their principal salience regulator. Forgive the cold and sensitive terminology, as I said, there's much more to it. And you can really look at some of these changes in the sense of presence, changes in the sense of reality. You can uncover some philosophically very revealing stuff about perception, belief, and the reality by doing that. And also, at the same time, some of these so-called pathological cases start to look less puzzling. It's not that the world of the schizophrenic person is irrevocably weird and we can't set foot in it. Our own world is pretty weird and subtly changeable in ways that are often not acknowledged.
Yes, first of all, a very interesting talk. The first one is perhaps just a comment. I have two comments. The first one is just a comment on that. I find there's actually a curious, perhaps to me, but surprising overlap with some of Marvin Minsky's ideas in the emotion machine, how these emotions as constructed with what you were getting at. Right? And the other thing is the question of, when making this kind of arguments, if we don't refer to beliefs as such, how would you actually demarcate a group of people with mental illnesses? What would you say are their defining characteristics of that group? It's not just an arbitrary assignment.
I don't think there are any defining characteristics of so-called mental illness as a whole. As things stand, I do refer to belief. I'm not saying the term belief has no referent. I'm not saying there's no such thing as belief. Rather, what I'm saying is the term belief in its various subtly different uses, which are often not distinguished, in fact refers to a wide range of different phenomena that are not added together. So I suppose an analogy would be, we can refer to, it's perfectly all right to refer to mammals, but not if we can't be bothered to distinguish between tigers and mice. The only problem is the term belief might turn out to be like mammals, bread things and bricks. Maybe it's not that bad. As for Marvin Minsky, I'm just not sure whether there's any relevance, but I'm certainly what this does link in closely with is research I'm doing on emotion regulation, which obviously involves an account of the nature of emotion. So it's at least in that respect, it's relevant.
Thank you very much for your very interesting paper. I wanted to submit you a different kind of social alienation, and I was wondering if the same model can apply. And it's a bit the same way you presented it, but just turned around. Because I think we can find that sometimes the inside voice is completely untrusted, and we don't believe it at all, and we only believe the external gaze, and we feel that we are, we seek it either positively, I want to be well seen and everything, or negatively you avoid it because you're ashamed or whatever. But then the inside voice, you don't trust it. You say, oh no, I don't know myself. I'm looking at what other people tell me about myself. Is it the same model? Can it
so the inside voice, you're not talking about voices in the so-called hallucination sense, are you?
No, in this sense.
More. I mean, I think that there are all sorts of ways in which one can doubt the efficacy of one's own thoughts, one's judgments, one's activities. There are all sorts of degrees and kinds of self-doubt. Is my thought process coherent? Have I come to a conclusion that makes sense? Is this right? And obviously there are varying degrees of insecurity which may involve particular thoughts or one's whole capacity to do certain things. And then one seeks reassurance from others. So what I would say about this range of cases is, as with the ones that I've mentioned, this is always going to involve the social world. Here one seeks reassurance. This lack of confidence in oneself is a change in one's relations with others. One needs a kind of reassurance from them. Perhaps one doesn't have that reassurance. And maybe one's seeking of it in some cases is altogether futile because one's not capable of sensing that one has it. So I think one would have to tease apart different cases. But I think what you're always going to find is that this isn't just an individual phenomenon. It's interpersonal and relational through and through.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That was great. I had a couple of things to ask you as you were talking. So one was comparing your account about the different levels of certainty and presence, you talk about delusions particularly, and John Campbell's paper on rational empirical account of delusion formation, something like that.
Yeah.
And John talks about top-down models of delusion formation and how this could, he makes an analogy with Wittgenstein's uncertainty, how this destabilizes language. Yeah, that's my first thought. So we can understand these people that are using words in a different way. I guess I'd like your thoughts on that and destabilization of meaning. And the second one was a bit more kind of clinical, was really if estrangement drives this, how can we engage them in a non-alienated view way of existence to improve outcomes?
I mean, in response to the first question, so Campbell's notion of delusions as framework propositions is Wittgenstein inspired. And I think he over-intellectualizes hinge propositions in uncertainty. And he also takes hinge propositions to involve, he also takes framework propositions to involve basically the same kind of conviction. It's just that they're certain rather than debatable. Whereas what I'm suggesting is effectively the certainty of certain delusions is different. It's precisely because one is unhinged. Hinges need to be understood in terms of something being utterly entrenched in a public world, but it's because one is unhinged from that world, that one's not susceptible to evidential processes, to processes of belief formation, revision, negotiation. So it's a different kind of certainty. And I've tried to argue this again myself with reference to Wittgenstein. So far as the actual clinical applications are concerned, this is quite an abstract talk, so I can't point to anything concrete. And I had a go at this for the first time in a paper entitled The Interpersonal Structure of Depression, which I published in a psychoanalysis journal a couple of months ago, where I just looked at ways in which this might be circumvented. For example, a crucial question would be, suppose one no longer anticipates the possibility of interpersonal connection. That doesn't mean that one is incapable of having the relevant experience, just that one can't anticipate having it. It seems impossible. You know, analogous to those cases where you sit there for 2 days distracting yourself on Google rather than starting to write a paper because the paper seems impossible, but then you manage to write it in the end. So just because something is anticipated in the guise of impossibility doesn't mean it is. Now, it might be for a person, they might be constitutionally incapable, but a key distinction would be between those cases where people really are and those cases where people just experience themselves as incapable. Then, of course, it's going to be situational and it's going to depend upon certain dialogical contexts and all sorts of things. So what you've got here isn't a simple answer, but if people accept this kind of approach, you have the beginning of a research program.
I mean, empirically, people can be open to the space of reasons
Yeah.
and over time change their beliefs.
Yeah, but I think, to put it very crudely, what you may have in some cases is something like the everyday scenario when you are feeling out of sorts and a friend sort of makes you feel at home in the world again, even though you didn't anticipate that as possible. You know, those rare evenings when you feel really crap and then the evening is just brilliant. I haven't had one of those for a while. It's getting very predictable. But it would be a more extreme variant of that, and I guess therapeutic skills that I don't have could come in here.
I'm afraid we probably have just a few seconds left and about 4 questions. So I would suggest we should probably conclude here and take the questions.